The studio lights that night felt warmer than usual, as if even the air understood something unforgettable was about to happen. The audience inside the grand Las Vegas showroom leaned forward in their velvet seats, their laughter already soft and expectant, because whenever Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. shared a stage, no one could predict what might unfold. It was never just a show. It was a dance of wit, pride, friendship, and the unspoken loyalty that only years could build. The Rat Pack had become more than entertainers. They were symbols of a certain American moment. Effortless charm, layered over deep resilience. That evening, Sammy was electric from the very first note. His tuxedo shimmered under the spotlight as he tapped across the stage, singing with that unmistakable intensity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rehearsed. Perfection. He was quick with rhythm, quick with humor, quick with a comeback. The crowd adored him for it. He lived in motion, in precision, in the joy of proving himself every single night. Dean, meanwhile, stood slightly behind him at first, relaxed as always, one hand tucked casually in his pocket, the other holding a glass that may or may not have held what everyone assumed it did. His persona was effortless ease. Where Sammy was lightning, Dean was gravity. Where Sammy sparkled, Dean glowed. They were opposites in style, yet perfectly balanced in presence. The playful rivalry between them had always been part of the act. Audiences loved it. The mock competitiveness, the exaggerated bravado, the teasing. It was theater built on trust. But beneath the humor lay something more meaningful. Both men had fought for their place in an industry that did not always welcome them equally. Sammy, especially, had climbed mountains few acknowledged publicly. Dean knew it. He never said it outright, but he knew it. Midway through the show, the band shifted tempo. The crowd quieted, sensing an improvised moment approaching. Sammy stepped toward Dean with that mischievous grin that signaled trouble, the good kind. He snapped his fingers twice, spun lightly on his heel, and faced the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with theatrical pride, "I'm faster than this man right here." Laughter rippled through the room. Sammy wasn't just talking about dance steps. He meant wit, timing, reflex. He meant he could outpace Dean in the game they both loved. Live banter in front of thousands. Dean raised an eyebrow slowly, deliberately. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to, Sammy continued, his voice playful but sharp. "I can sing quicker, talk quicker, and I can definitely think quicker. You give me 10 seconds, I'll win every time." The audience leaned in. This was the kind of tension they paid to see friendly fire between legends. Dean stepped forward at last. He didn't rush. He didn't adjust his jacket. He simply looked at Sammy, then at the crowd. It was silence, not awkward, but thick with anticipation. 10 seconds. That was all he took. He sipped from his glass, glanced sideways at Sammy, and said calmly, "Sammy, you may be faster, but I never had to run." The room exploded. It wasn't loud laughter at first. It was stunned silence for half a heartbeat. Then a wave of realization washing through the audience like thunder rolling across desert skies. The brilliance of it wasn't in the insult. There was none. It was in the elegance. In one sentence, Dean had turned speed into steadiness, competition into confidence. He didn't deny Sammy's talent. He reframed the entire premise. Sammy blinked, then threw his head back laughing. Not offended, impressed, he pointed at Dean and shouted, "You see? That's why he gets the last word." The band struck a triumphant chord. The crowd rose to their feet, but what made that moment unforgettable wasn't just the cleverness. It was the undercurrent beneath it. In those 10 seconds, Dean had reminded everyone, including Sammy, that greatness comes in many forms. Speed dazzles, precision amazes, but calm confidence endures. Later that night, backstage away from the cheers and bright lights, the atmosphere softened. The performers loosened their bow ties and wiped stage makeup from their faces. Sammy sat on a wooden stool, still energized, tapping his foot against the floor as if the rhythm refused to leave him. Dean approached quietly. "You okay?" Dean asked, his tone gentle. Sammy smiled. You always gotta do that, don't you? Make it look easy. Dean shrugged. It is easy. When you don't try too hard. Sammy looked at him thoughtfully. You ever worry they'll stop laughing? Dean paused longer than usual before answering. Only if we stop being real. That was the truth between them. The humor worked because it wasn't forced. Their friendship held because it wasn't competitive at its core. It was built on mutual respect, on surviving criticism, on navigating fame's strange, isolating corridors together. Sammy had once faced barriers that tried to slow him down. Dean had watched those moments quietly, sometimes stepping forward when it mattered most, sometimes offering support in ways the public never saw. Their dynamic wasn't just comedy, it was quiet solidarity. The next night, word had already spread about the 10-second comeback. Crowds arrived eager to witness lightning strike twice. But that's the thing about authenticity. It cannot be scheduled. It can only happen. During the encore, instead of trying to top the previous night, Dean gestured toward Sammy and said simply, Ladies and gentlemen, the fastest man in show business. Sammy responded by placing his arm around Dean's shoulder, and the smoothest, no punchline followed. None was needed. In that exchange, the rivalry dissolved into something deeper. Acknowledgement. They understood that neither was greater alone than they were together. The audience felt it. The applause that followed wasn't just for talent. It was for brotherhood. Years later, people would remember that 10-second line as legendary. They would repeat it in interviews and documentaries, analyzing the wit and timing. But those who were there remembered something else. The look they shared afterward. Not challenge, not ego, just quiet pride. Because in the end, it wasn't about being faster. It was about knowing who you are when the spotlight hits. And that night, in 10 effortless seconds, Dean Martin proved that sometimes the strongest comeback isn't loud or sharp. It's steady. It's rooted in knowing your worth without having to race anyone else to prove it. The curtain eventually fell. The lights dimmed. But the echo of laughter lingered in that Las Vegas room long after the seats emptied. Men walked off stage, side by side, not competitors, but partners in a performance that would outlive them both. And somewhere in the quiet hallway behind the curtain, Sammy nudged Dean with a grin. Tomorrow, he said, I'm bringing 20 seconds. Dean smiled back, unhurried as ever. I'll only need 5. The headlines the next morning focused on the punchline. Reporters wrote about the 10-second comeback. Columnists praised the wit of Dean Martin and the electric spark of Sammy Davis Jr. Radio hosts replayed the moment, retelling it as if it had been scripted. But the truth was far more powerful because nothing about that exchange had been planned, and what happened 3 nights later would test whether their friendship was stronger than applause. The Sands showroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Word had spread. Everyone expected another duel of charm, another playful clash, another round of speed versus smooth, but Sammy did not step onto that stage with the same lightness. Earlier that afternoon, he'd received a call, not from a reporter, not from a friend, from a man who quietly suggested that maybe the jokes were getting too comfortable, that maybe certain audiences didn't appreciate too much equality in the spotlight. The message was subtle, but clear. Sammy had heard that tone before in his life. It was the tone that said, "You're welcome here," but only within limits. By the time the curtain rose, Sammy's usual sparkle carried a sharper edge. The band struck up a fast tempo, and he delivered his opening number flawlessly, but there was intensity beneath the rhythm. He danced harder, sang louder, smiled wider. Dean watched from the side. He noticed, when Sammy finished, the applause was thunderous. He bowed deeply, then turned toward Dean with a grin that was slightly too tight. "Well, Dino," Sammy said, "you still think you don't have to run?" The audience laughed, expecting the usual. Dean stepped forward slowly. Before he could respond, a voice from the back shouted, something crude, something aimed not at the joke, but at the man. The laughter cracked. For a split second, the entire room shifted. Out, the kind of silence that doesn't feel playful.
The kind that
tests courage. Sammy heard it. Of course he did. His jaw tightened. He could have ignored it. He had ignored worse in his career. He could have turned it into humor. He had done that before, too. Could have danced faster, outpaced the moment. But this time, didn't move. He stood still. Dean felt the temperature in the room drop. He could see the decision forming behind Sammy's eyes, that familiar crossroads between pride and performance. And then, before anyone else could speak, Dean walked directly to center stage. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a hand on Sammy's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said evenly, "you're looking at the fastest man I know." A few nervous chuckles. Dean continued, his voice steady, but firmer now. "And you're also looking at the bravest." The room stilled again. Dean scanned the crowd, not searching for the heckler, but addressing everyone, you see. Went on, "It's easy to laugh when the joke's on stage. It's harder to respect the man who earned the spotlight." Sammy's eyes flickered toward him, surprised. Dean took one more slow step forward. "I never had to run," he said quietly, echoing his earlier line. But this man had to outrun every doubt, every door that tried to close on him. And he still showed up smiling. There was no music behind him now. No rim shot. No band flourish, just truth, and it landed heavier than any punchline ever could. A woman in the front row began to clap softly at first, then another, then dozens. The applause grew not from humor, but from recognition. Sammy felt something shift inside him, not anger, not hurt, relief. Dean turned toward him then, lowering his voice so only Sammy could hear. 10 seconds, Dean murmured. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Sammy swallowed hard. For a man known for speed, he suddenly felt grounded, anchored. He stepped forward again, but this time not to challenge. "You know what?" Sammy said, his voice carrying warmth instead of defiance. "Tonight I'm not faster." Audience leaned closer. "Tonight I'm just grateful." And that admission, simple and unscripted, broke whatever tension had lingered in the air. The band resumed softly. Dean gave Sammy a gentle nudge. "Sing," Dean said. Sammy chose. A slower song than planned. Not a flashy number, not a high-energy tap routine. A ballad. His voice filled the room differently now. Less sparkle. More soul. And as he sang, Dean stood behind him. Not stealing focus, not adding commentary, just present. Arms folded. Watching. The performance that followed wasn't remembered for speed or wit. It was remembered for dignity. Backstage afterward, Sammy sat quietly, staring at the mirror in the dressing room. His reflection looked tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Dean entered without knocking. "You didn't have to do that," Sammy said without turning around. "Yes, I did," Dean replied. Sammy finally met his eyes in the mirror. "Why?" Dean leaned against the wall, casual but sincere. "Because I don't care how fast you are," he said. "No one outruns respect." Sammy let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You ever get tired of being the calm one?" he asked. Dean smiled faintly. "It's only when people mistake calm for weakness." Sammy stood then, crossing the room. "You know," he said, "people think we're always competing." Dean chuckled. "Let them, but we're not," Sammy continued. "We're protecting something." Dean raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "The right to be ourselves on that stage." That word lingered. Ourselves, not characters, not stereotypes, not rivals. Men, artists, friends. The next night, something different happened. As the curtain opened, Dean walked out first, alone. The crowd murmured, confused. Dean cleared his throat and said, "Before we start, I want you to understand something." The room quieted immediately. "What you saw last night wasn't a joke," he continued. "It was a reminder. We don't stand up here because we're perfect. We stand here because we've earned it." Then he gestured toward the wings, "And I never stand alone." Sammy stepped out beside him. The applause this time felt different, not wild, not explosive, but full, deep. respectful. Sammy leaned toward Dean and whispered, "You used more than 10 seconds tonight." Dean smiled. "Yeah," he replied. "Some things deserve it." When the music started again, there was no rivalry in the air, only partnership, only strength that didn't need to shout. Because sometimes the most powerful story isn't the one that makes people laugh. It's the one that makes them understand. And that week in Las Vegas, two legends proved that friendship, real friendship, can silence more than a room. It can silence doubt. It can silence fear. The applause that followed that week in Las Vegas should have been enough to carry them for months. The headlines softened. The critics praised the unexpected depth of the show. Fans wrote letters describing how moved they felt. But success has a way of stirring other forces that do not clap. A few weeks later, during a private rehearsal at the Sands, Dean Martin noticed something unusual. The house manager stood near the stage with two unfamiliar men in dark suits. They weren't smiling. They weren't tapping their feet to the music. They were watching, measuring. Sammy finished a fast-paced number and wiped sweat from his brow. "You see that?" he muttered quietly as he walked past Dean. Dean nodded almost imperceptibly. After rehearsal, the message came. Not loudly, not publicly. Certain investors felt the show was getting political. Certain guests had expressed discomfort. Certain sponsors preferred a lighter tone. The word certain was repeated. Too many times, Sammy listened without interrupting. He had heard similar language before in different rooms. It always meant the same thing: stay entertaining but not too real. When the manager finished, he added one final suggestion. Maybe scale back the serious moments. People come here to escape. Sammy's eyes hardened slightly. Escape what? No one answered. Dean stepped forward before the silence could stretch too far. "We'll think about it," he said calmly. Outside, the Nevada desert wind cut sharply against the night air. The city glittered in the distance, but away from the lights, it felt colder. Sammy stopped walking. "You going to think about it?" he asked. Dean didn't answer immediately. Looked out at the horizon instead, hands in his coat pockets. "Sam," he finally said, "they're afraid of discomfort." Sammy let out a short laugh. "You mean truth?" Dean turned toward him. "Truth makes people uncomfortable, so we're supposed to shrink," Sammy shot back. Dean stepped closer, lowering his voice. "No. We're supposed to choose our moment." Sammy paced, frustration rising. "I've spent my whole career choosing my moment." "And you've chosen well," Dean replied evenly. "But sometimes strength isn't louder. It's smarter." Sammy stopped pacing and stared at him. "You think I don't know that?" Dean held his gaze. "Think you know it too well." The tension between them was different now. Not playful, not theatrical, real. The next night's performance carried an invisible weight. The room was packed, but the laughter came slower. The band played tighter, as if they too sensed something was shifting. Midway through the show, Sammy launched into one of his rapid-fire routines. He moved like lightning, voice sharp, feet precise. The crowd applauded, but there was hesitation in certain sections of the room, quiet pockets of resistance.
That
Came the moment. Dean walked out during the transition, glass in hand as usual. He glanced at Sammy and said, "You still the fastest man alive?" Sammy smirked. "Faster than you, Dino." The audience chuckled softly. Dean stepped closer. "But speed," he said, "isn't everything." Sammy's grin faltered slightly. "Wasn't sure where Dean was going," Dean continued, his tone steady. "Sometimes you run so fast you don't see who's trying to slow you down." The room quieted. Sammy froze. This wasn't in rehearsal. Dean turned toward the audience. "You know what I admire about this man?" he asked. "He's been told to slow down his whole life. He's told to soften his voice, told to fit someone else's idea of comfort." The silence deepened, and he didn't. Sammy's eyes glistened. Under the stage lights, but he didn't move. Dean took one final step forward. He didn't run because he was afraid, Dean said. He ran because he believed the finish line was worth reaching. The applause didn't explode. It built. Slowly, powerfully. Sammy swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being defended so openly, so deliberately.
Ah!
He stepped forward, voice softer now. You trying to get us fired? He joked weakly. Dean tilted his head. Maybe.
The crowd laughed again, but there was tension in it.
Suspense. The band hesitated, unsure whether to play. Sammy made a choice. Instead of launching into another fast number, he took the microphone off its stand and spoke plainly. You know what's funny? He said. They say we're entertainers, but sometimes entertainment is the only place people hear honesty. A murmur swept through the room. He continued, I don't want you uncomfortable. I just want you awake. Dean stood beside him, not speaking now, just present. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not confrontation. Awareness. The show continued. They sang. They joked. They danced. But beneath it all was a new layer, one of deliberate courage. Backstage afterward, the atmosphere was thick. A producer approached them, voice tight. You're walking a fine line, Dean shrugged. That's where balance lives. Sammy waited until they were alone. You didn't have to push it, Sammy said quietly. Dean leaned against the dressing room table. I didn't push. I stood. Sammy shook his head. You're risking your image. Dean smiled faintly. My image survives. Your dignity matters. The words hung in the air. For the first time, Sammy didn't have a fast reply. Later that week, a rumor spread that their residency might not be renewed. The investors were uneasy. Safe path would have been to soften. The message, to return fully to harmless banter. Dean considered it. Sammy, didn't you ever think, Sammy asked one evening as they sat alone in the empty showroom, that we're standing on something bigger than this stage? Dean looked at the vacant seats. I know we are, he said. Sammy's voice lowered. Then why does it feel like it could all disappear overnight? Dean answered, without hesitation. Because it could. The honesty startled Sammy. But, Dean added, if it disappears because we stood upright, then it was never ours to begin with. Silence filled the room. The next performance would decide everything. Sponsors attended. Executives filled the back rows. The atmosphere buzzed with tension. Sammy stepped onto the stage first. He didn't sprint into his opening number. He walked slowly, deliberately. Dean followed, equally composed. For the first half hour, they delivered pure entertainment, timing flawless, chemistry effortless. The crowd relaxed. Laughter returned freely. Then came the final act. Sammy turned to Dean and said loudly, I'm faster. The audience laughed, remembering the famous line. Dean raised his eyebrow. Maybe, he replied. Sammy leaned in closer. But tonight, he said, voice steady, I'm not running. Dean smiled. Good, he said softly, because neither am I. The band struck a bold chord. The crowd rose not in explosive noise, but in unified applause. It wasn't rebellion. It was respect. After the curtain fell, the investors said nothing. The sponsors made no threats. The show wasn't canceled, but something had changed. They had crossed from entertainers into something more enduring, symbols. And as they walked down the dim hallway behind the stage, Sammy nudged Dean lightly. You always take your time, Sammy said. Dean smirked. And you always get there first. Sammy shook his head. Not first, he said quietly. Just free. Dean looked at him carefully. Freedom, not speed. Not applause. Freedom. And for the first time since that heckler's voice had pierced the room weeks earlier, Sammy felt it not because the room was silent, but because it no longer had the power to silence him. Dean placed a hand on his shoulder once more. 10 seconds, he said softly. Sammy smiled. This time he replied, it took longer. And in that lengthened silence between spotlight and shadow, two men proved that courage is not measured by how fast you speak, but by how firmly you stand when the room turns cold. Years passed, and the laughter never truly faded. It only matured. Las Vegas changed. Audiences changed. Even the rhythm of show business changed. But the bond between Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. carried something that trends could not. Erased, they were no longer just two men trading clever lines under stage lights. They had become living proof that loyalty could exist inside fame, that rivalry could strengthen friendship instead of fracture it, and that dignity could outlast applause. But time introduces a different kind of suspense, the kind no one rehearses. 4. One winter evening, years after the famous 10 seconds, Dean stood alone backstage at a televised reunion special. The audience buzzed beyond the curtain, waiting for the legends to return together once more. Sammy was late. Not dramatically late. Not irresponsibly late. Just late enough for Dean to notice the quiet anxiety forming in his chest. A stage manager approached him softly. "He'll be here," she assured. Dean nodded, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the stage floor where years earlier they had stood. Shoulder to shoulder, he remembered the heckler. He remembered the silence. He remembered the first time. Sammy's laughter had carried something heavier than joy. The dressing room door finally opened. Sammy entered, older now, movements slightly slower, but eyes still sharp. The speed that once defined him had softened, replaced by a different kind of presence, the kind that comes from surviving storms. "You pacing?" Sammy teased lightly. Dean smirked. "You're late." "I thought you said you never had to." "Run." Dean didn't laugh this time. "You okay?" he asked. Sammy paused. The energy shifted. "You ever feel," Sammy said quietly, "like the stage gets smaller?" Dean considered the question. "Or we get bigger?" Sammy shook his head. "Gently. No. Smaller." There it was. The vulnerability that rarely stepped into the spotlight. The years had not been easy. Health scares, industry shifts, the subtle cruelty of age in a business built on youth. The applause still came, but it no longer roared the same way. Dean placed a hand on Sammy's shoulder, the same gesture he had made on that night when laughter turned tense. "It's not the stage shrinking," Dean said calmly. "It's the noise fading." Sammy studied him. "And when the noise fades?" he asked. Dean's eyes softened. "That's when you hear what matters." The call came from the stage. 2 minutes, Sammy adjusted his jacket, breathing in slowly. "You still think you can beat me in 10 seconds? He asked with a faint grin. Dean replied without hesitation. "Sam, at this point, I just want to walk beside you." The curtain rose. The audience erupted. Older faces now, many who had followed them for decades. People who remembered not just the jokes, but the courage woven between them. They opened. With a familiar routine, the classic banter returned, smooth and precise. Laughter filled the theater. But beneath it was something deeper, a shared history between performers and audience alike. Midway through the show, Sammy paused. He stepped forward without cue. "You know," he said slowly, "people always remember the fast lines, the quick jokes, the sharp comebacks." The room quieted. "But the moments I remember most," he continued, "were the quiet ones." Dean felt it coming. Sammy turned toward him, voice steady but emotional. "There was a night," he said, "when someone tried to shrink me." A ripple of understanding moved through the audience, and this man didn't let it happen. Dean looked down briefly, uncomfortable with praise. Sammy went on. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. Steady. "The theater was silent now," I said. "I was faster," Sammy continued, smiling gently. "But he reminded me. You don't outrun respect." Dean swallowed. The applause this time was not explosive. It was reverent. Dean stepped forward at last. "Sammy," he said quietly, "you were always faster." Sammy shook his head. "No," he replied. "I was just trying to keep up." Dean leaned closer to the microphone, and "I was trying to make sure you never had to." The power of that sentence didn't need embellishment. It settled over the room like a truth long known but rarely spoken. The band began a soft instrumental. No flashy tempo. No racing rhythm. Just melody. They sang together, not competing for notes, not trying to outshine. Their voices blended. Differently now. Less about perfection and more about presence. And for a moment, time felt suspended. Backstage after the performance, The atmosphere was unusually quiet. No reporters rushed in. No executives offered notes. Just the two of them. Sammy sat down slowly, exhaling. "You ever think about the end?" he asked. Dean didn't pretend not to understand of the show. Dean replied. "Of the spotlight." Sammy corrected. Dean leaned back. "Considering the spotlight ends," he said. "But what we built doesn't." Sammy looked at him carefully. "And what did we build?" Dean smiled faintly. "A place where no one has to run." The simplicity of it landed heavy. They had spent decades inside an industry built on speed. Faster jokes, faster fame, faster exits. But what endured wasn't speed. It was steadiness. Weeks later, during one of their final joint appearances, the audience requested the famous line. They wanted the nostalgia. The punchline. Sammy obliged. "I'm faster," he declared playfully. The crowd laughed in anticipation. Dean paused longer than 10 seconds this time, then, he said softly. "Maybe. But we finished together." The room stood in unison. Not because it was funny, because it was true. Years after the stages dimmed and the shows concluded, people would still tell the story of that 10-second comeback. They would quote it as clever, iconic, legendary. But those who understood the deeper meaning knew something else. The real comeback was never about wit. It was about standing still when someone tried to push you aside. It was about speaking calmly. When the room turned cold, it was about friendship that chose dignity over ego. In the quiet corridors behind fame, two men had discovered that the strongest performance isn't. It's the one that wins the laugh. It's the one that protects the person beside you. And in the end, the last word was never a joke. It was loyalty. It was courage. It was the unhurried strength of a man who never had to run, and the fearless spirit of a man who ran anyway until he no longer had to. The spotlight eventually faded. But the echo of their partnership still lives not in how fast they spoke, but in how firmly they stood.